The moment I stepped out of my car, I already felt something was wrong. Military funerals are supposed to be quiet, not just silent but heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and reminds you to breathe slower. That morning the air felt tight, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Flags stood still, uniforms were crisp, shoes lined up perfectly on the pavement. Every movement was deliberate, respectful. I wasn't there as a spectator, I was there because I owed him, because some debts don't ever get paid back no matter how much time passes. As the honor guard took their positions, I noticed a few neighbors watching from their porches. No one said a word, even the birds seemed quieter than usual. This was one of those moments where you expect the world to pause with you. Then I heard an engine. At first I thought it was just someone passing by, maybe lost, but the sound didn't fade, it slowed. Tires crunched against gravel much closer than they should have been. Heads turned. A black SUV rolled in like it owned the street, stopping just feet from the gathered family. The driver's door opened hard. She stepped out fast, sunglasses already on, clipboard tucked under her arm like it was part of her body. She didn't look around to understand what was happening. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't hesitate. "Who approved this?" The words landed wrong, sharp, out of place, like laughter at the wrong time. For a second, nobody responded, not because we didn't hear her, but because we couldn't believe someone had actually said that here, now, today. She sighed loudly, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "This is a residential area. You can't just block access and set up an event." An event? That word hit harder than it should have. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed where I was. I'd dealt with people like her before, the kind who mistake authority for importance, the kind who think rules matter more than context. The chaplain paused mid-sentence. The honor guard didn't move, but I could feel the tension ripple through them. The family stood frozen, grief interrupted by confusion. I took a step forward, keeping my voice low. "Ma'am, we're in the middle of a funeral." She finally looked at me, really looked. Her eyes flicked over my suit, then past me to the flags. No reaction, no shame, just annoyance. "Well, funerals still need approval," she said. "Especially with uniforms and displays. HOA rules are very clear." Somewhere behind me I heard someone inhale sharply. Another neighbor started recording. Phones came out quietly, instinctively, like people already knew this was about to get ugly. I tried again. "This won't take long, we'll clear the street as soon as." She cut me off with a raised hand. "Sir, I'm not here to debate, I'm here to enforce." "Enforce?" She flipped a page on her clipboard, reading like she was checking off chores. "Parking violation, unauthorized assembly, noise concerns." She said it all without once lowering her voice. I glanced at the folded flag resting on the stand, perfectly aligned, untouched, sacred. She didn't even notice it. "That vehicle needs to be moved," she said, pointing toward the hearse. "Immediately." That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to end quietly. I felt something shift in my chest, a slow burn, not anger yet, something colder, something controlled. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "this is not the time." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to feel threatening. "If you don't comply, I'll contact local authorities." The word authorities echoed in my head. Behind her, the flag stood unmoving. In front of her, a family tried to grieve. And standing there, listening to her threaten a military funeral with police enforcement, I understood something very clearly. This woman had no idea where she was standing. And she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. The sound of her pen clicking against that clipboard was louder than it should have been. Click, click, click. Each time it echoed, it felt like another crack in the silence we were trying so hard to protect. I watched the chaplain lower his eyes, unsure whether to continue or step aside. The honor guard stood perfectly still, but I could see their jaws tightening. Discipline held them in place, but barely. She took a step closer to the hearse. I moved without thinking, placing myself between her and the vehicle, not aggressively, not touching her, just enough to make it clear she wasn't getting any closer. "Sir," she said sharply, "you're obstructing an HOA official." That phrase almost made me laugh, almost. I'm asking you to step back, I replied. My voice stayed calm, but I could feel the tension buzzing just under my skin. You're disrupting a funeral. She scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. Funeral or not, this neighborhood has rules, and I don't see any permits posted. Permits? She actually said permits. Behind me I heard a quiet sob. One of the family members had finally broken down, the weight of the moment crashing into her all at once. The sound cut straight through me. That was grief trying to survive an interruption it didn't deserve. I turned slightly, lowering my voice. Ma'am, have some respect. Her eyes narrowed behind the sunglasses. Respect goes both ways, and right now you're being very disrespectful to the community. The community. She gestured broadly, as if she spoke for every home on the street. I glanced around. Neighbors had gathered closer now, standing in driveways, on sidewalks, phones raised. No one looked like they were on her side. She flipped another page. Let's see, excessive gathering, unapproved use of common space. This is a public street, someone muttered. She ignored it. I'm issuing a citation, she announced, ripping a yellow slip from the pad. The paper fluttered in the air like it didn't even want to be there. That's when I felt it, the shift, the moment politeness stopped being an option. You're not doing that, I said. She froze for half a second, then smiled, a tight, confident smile. Excuse me. You heard me. Her voice rose immediately. Are you threatening me? No, I replied. I'm telling you this ends now. That was all it took. She stepped back dramatically, pulling her phone out like a weapon. I'm calling the police. I feel unsafe. Unsafe? Surrounded by grieving families, uniformed service members, and a folded American flag, she claimed she felt unsafe. She turned slightly away, but not enough to lose her audience. I could hear her voice clearly as she spoke into the phone, exaggerating every word. Yes, I'm an HOA officer. There's a large, unauthorized gathering. People are refusing to comply and becoming aggressive. Aggressive? I stood there, hands at my sides, breathing slow. The irony tasted bitter. While she talked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the honor guard members shifted his weight, just barely. A micro movement, but enough to tell me this was pushing the limits of their restraint. The chaplain closed his book. We waited. Minutes passed, each second stretched longer than the last. The silence returned, but it was different now, sharper, tense, like a storm hovering just overhead. When the police finally arrived, their sirens were muted as they pulled in. Two officers stepped out, scanning the scene with confusion written all over their faces. She rushed toward them immediately. Thank God, she said loudly. They're blocking the street and refusing lawful HOA orders. One officer glanced past her, taking in the uniforms, the flags, the hearse. His expression changed. Ma'am, he said slowly, what exactly is going on here? She crossed her arms. They're holding an unapproved event. The officer looked at me then. His eyes dropped briefly to the folded flag. He took a breath. Sir, he asked quietly, is this a military funeral? I nodded. His jaw tightened. Before he could say anything else, she jumped back in. That doesn't matter. HOA jurisdiction still applies. The officer paused. And that pause told me everything. Because in that moment, I realized she wasn't just interrupting a funeral anymore. She was about to challenge the wrong kind of authority. The officer didn't answer her right away. That silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. He looked from the folded flag to the honor guard, then back to the woman with the clipboard. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't what he expected when he answered that call. She didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. So she pressed, tapping her clipboard again. Are you going to enforce the violation or not? The second officer stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the hearse. Ma'am, why don't you give us a moment to assess the situation? I've already assessed it, she snapped. They're in violation. I watched the first officer exhale slowly, the kind of breath you take when you're trying to stay professional. He turned to me. "Sir, can you explain your connection to this gathering?" I answered simply, "We're here to bury a soldier." That should have been enough. It was. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "That's not an answer, anyone can say that." The officer's head snapped toward her. "Ma'am." She raised her hands slightly, palms out. "I'm just saying emotions don't override regulations." I felt my fingers curl into a fist at my side, not tight enough to show, but enough to remind myself to stay still. The officer looked back at me. "Are you family?" "Yes, sir." "How close, sir?" "Close enough to be here." That seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once, then turned to her. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." Her posture stiffened. "I'm not stepping back. I'm the HOA authority for this neighborhood." "Right now," he said evenly, "I'm asking you to give us space." She shook her head. "You can't tell me that." The words barely left her mouth before she pointed at the flag stand. "That display is not approved under HOA guidelines. It needs to be removed." Everything stopped. I heard a sharp intake of breath behind me. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" The honor guard commander turned his head. Slowly, deliberately, he didn't move his feet, he didn't speak, he just looked at her. And for the first time since she arrived, she hesitated. Just for a second. Then she doubled down. "This is a residential neighborhood," she said louder, clearly trying to regain control. "We don't allow military demonstrations without prior notice." "Demonstrations?" The officer's tone changed. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again to step away." She crossed her arms. "Or what?" The question hung there. I could feel every eye on us. The family, the neighbors, the men in uniform who had been trained to stand still under fire, now being tested by a clipboard and a sense of entitlement. The officer glanced at his partner, then back at me. "Sir, do you have identification?" I reached into my pocket, already knowing what was coming. I handed it to him without hesitation. Before he could even look at it, she lunged forward and grabbed it out of his hand. "Hey," the officer snapped. "Ma'am." She ignored him, flipping the card over, her lips moving as she read. Her face changed. It wasn't dramatic, no gasp, no sudden panic, just a subtle shift. The confidence drained from her posture like air from a tire. She cleared her throat. "This isn't relevant." The officer held out his hand. "Ma'am, give me the ID." She hesitated, then handed it back, suddenly very careful not to touch me. The officer studied it now, his eyebrows lifted slightly, just slightly, then he looked at me differently. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "can you step aside with me for a moment?" She immediately protested. "Absolutely not, I need to be present for any discussion." The officer didn't even look at her. "No, you don't." That was new. I stepped away with him just a few feet, enough that the conversation wasn't public, but close enough that everyone could see the separation. "Is this going to be a problem?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "Only if she keeps pushing." He nodded slowly. "Understood." Behind us I heard her voice rising again. "I want this documented. I want badge numbers. I want names." I turned back just in time to see the honor guard commander take one step forward. Not fast, not aggressive. Just enough to make it clear that the line she was standing on was disappearing. And suddenly, she realized she wasn't in charge of this moment anymore. The commander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "this ceremony will continue." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Years of discipline, authority earned the hard way, not printed on a clipboard. She stared at him, clearly unsure whether she was allowed to challenge someone in uniform. She chose wrong. "You don't have jurisdiction here," she snapped, forcing confidence back into her tone. "This is HOA-governed property." The officer turned toward her, his patience thinning. "Ma'am, this is a public street." She scoffed. "That doesn't matter. The HOA maintains it." I could see the second officer rub his jaw. eyes fixed on the ground like he was counting to 10. This had gone far enough, and everyone knew it. The commander looked past her, addressing the officers instead. This is a military funeral authorized under federal guidelines. That did it. The first officer's posture changed, his shoulders squared. Ma'am, I'm instructing you to step away from the ceremony. She laughed short and sharp. Or what? You're going to arrest me for enforcing community standards. The words echoed uncomfortably. Actually, the officer replied, you're interfering with a lawful memorial. Her smile faltered again. I watched her eyes flick to the phone's recording, to the neighbors who had edged closer, to the family standing frozen in disbelief. She was losing the room, and she knew it. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. She pointed at me. He's the problem. He's the one escalating this. The officer glanced at me, then back at her. Sir has been cooperative. That's not what I observed, she shot back. He refused to comply. I want his information logged. The officer nodded once. We already have it. Her head snapped toward him. You what? He provided identification voluntarily. Her mouth opened, then closed. She tried to recover, smoothing her blazer. Well, then you understand he's in violation. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the commander. Would you like to proceed? The commander nodded. The chaplain opened his book again. The honor guard adjusted their stance. The ceremony resumed. She stood there stunned, as if the world had just decided to move on without her permission. No, she said sharply, you can't just ignore this. She stepped forward again. That was the moment the officer placed himself directly in her path. Ma'am, he said, firm now, if you continue, you will be removed from the area. Her eyes widened. Removed? Yes. For what? Causing a disturbance. The word hung in the air like a verdict. She looked around desperately, searching for support. She found none. Behind me, I heard the first quiet words of the service spoken again. The voice trembled, but it continued. She leaned toward the officer, lowering her voice. You're making a mistake. I know people. I can file complaints. He didn't blink. You're welcome to do that later. Later. That word finally landed. She stepped back, fuming, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield. For the first time since she arrived, she was silent. The service moved forward inch by inch, reclaiming the space she'd tried to take over. The sound of measured footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the quiet dignity returning to the street. I thought it was over. I was wrong. As the ceremony reached its most solemn moment, I heard her voice again, sharp and urgent, whispered into her phone. I need to file an official report, immediately. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Because I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't trying to stop the funeral anymore. She was trying to make sure this followed me home. I didn't look back, but I could feel her eyes on me. The ceremony continued, but the air never fully relaxed. Every word from the chaplain landed heavier now, shaped by what had just happened. Grief doesn't like interruptions. Once you break its rhythm, it doesn't settle easily. The folded flag rested between us, perfectly still. I focused on that, on keeping my breathing steady, on not giving her another reason to insert herself into a moment she had already damaged. When the final words were spoken, the honor guard moved in unison, slow, precise, the kind of movement that demands attention without asking for it. The sound of their boots was soft but deliberate, echoing down the street. She stood off to the side now, phone pressed to her ear, whispering urgently. Every few seconds she glanced over, as if hoping someone would give her permission to interrupt again. No one did. The rifle salute cracked through the air. Once, twice, 3 times. Each shot felt like a release, like the tension finally had somewhere to go. A few people flinched, some cried openly. Even the neighbors filming lowered their phones for that moment. She didn't flinch. When the final note of the bugle sounded, the street went completely still. The kind of stillness that feels sacred, the kind you don't touch unless you understand it. She touched it anyway. As the honor guard began folding the flag, she stepped closer again, not all the way, just enough to be seen. "This is taking too long," she muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We need to reopen the street." I turned my head slowly, not fully, just enough for her to know I heard. The officer heard too. "Ma'am," he warned quietly. She raised a finger. "I'm not interrupting, I'm just stating a fact." The commander finished folding the flag and handed it to the family. The moment was raw, exposed, private, the kind of moment that doesn't forgive intrusion. That's when she said it. "If you don't clear this now, I'll file a formal obstruction complaint against the residents involved." "Residents involved?" The officer closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, his voice was controlled but colder than before. "Ma'am, you've been instructed to remain back." "I'm within my rights," she insisted. "I've already started the paperwork." I felt something shift inside me again, not anger, resolution. I turned fully toward her for the first time since the ceremony resumed. "Do what you think you need to do." She smiled, triumphant. "Oh, I will." The officers stayed until the family left, ensuring she kept her distance. She paced near her SUV, typing furiously on her phone, occasionally pointing at me as if narrating the scene to someone on the other end. When the street finally cleared, the officers approached me. "Sir," one of them said, lowering his voice, "she's planning to file multiple complaints." "I expected that," I replied. He nodded. "Just wanted you to know." She watched us talk, her expression sharp, calculating. Before the officers left, she called out, "You'll be hearing from the HOA." I met her gaze, I'm sure. She climbed into her SUV and drove off, tires spinning slightly as if anger needed an outlet. The street felt empty after that, too quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm you know isn't finished. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at the spot where the flag had been folded. The echo of the bugle still rang in my ears. That's when my phone vibrated. An email notification. Subject line: notice of violation, immediate action required. I opened it and realized she hadn't just crossed a line at the funeral. She was trying to turn it into a war. I didn't read the email right away. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, standing there a moment longer than I probably should have. The street looked normal again, cars parked where they always had, lawns trimmed just enough to satisfy HOA standards. If you didn't know what had just happened, you'd never guess anything was wrong. But I knew. By the time I got home, the email had multiplied. 2 more followed the first, then a text message, then another email, this one marked urgent. She wasn't cooling off, she was accelerating. I sat at my kitchen table and finally opened the first message. The language was stiff, overly formal and clearly rushed. Unauthorized gathering, interference with HOA enforcement, failure to comply with lawful instructions. Each sentence was written like it was meant to intimidate, not inform. I almost smiled. Almost. The second email added fines. The third threatened legal action. She CC'd the HOA board, the property manager, and someone I'd never seen copied on anything before. She wanted witnesses, she wanted pressure. What she didn't realize was that pressure only works when you panic. I forwarded the emails to a separate folder and started a timeline. Time, location, witnesses, names. I typed slowly, carefully, not emotionally. This wasn't about winning an argument, this was about accuracy. My phone rang while I was typing. Unknown number. I answered, "Hello." Her voice came through immediately, tight and controlled. "You need to understand the seriousness of what you did today." I leaned back in my chair. "I attended a funeral." "You obstructed HOA operations," she snapped. "You undermined my authority in front of law enforcement." I let the silence stretch, let her fill it. "I'm prepared to escalate this," she continued. "I have documentation, video, statements." "So do I," I replied calmly. That stopped her. For your sake, she said after a pause, I suggest you settle this quickly. Apologize, pay the fines, we can move on. Apologize? I looked at the timeline on my screen. The folded flag, the police officers, the neighbors filming, the moment she touched the stand. No, I said simply. Her tone shifted, then I'll see you in court. You might, I answered, but not the way you think. She hung up. The next morning a formal letter appeared taped to my door, bold lettering, legal formatting, threats dressed up as policy. She worked late, I'd give her that. By noon the HOA board sent out a neighborhood-wide notice, a reminder about unauthorized gatherings, about compliance, about consequences. Neighbors started texting me, quiet messages, supportive ones, some angry on my behalf, some asking if this was really happening. I told them the truth, yes, and it wasn't over. That afternoon I made one call, not to threaten, not to complain. To notify. By evening the HOA president's email tone changed. Less confident, more careful, she asked for a meeting, suggested we resolve misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. I agreed to meet, not because I was worried. Because I wanted everything on record. That night I sat at my desk and reviewed the law surrounding military funerals, federal protections, civil penalties, case history, clear lines, clear consequences. She had tried to turn a funeral into an HOA violation. What she didn't realize was that she had turned it into something much bigger. And tomorrow she was going to learn exactly how paperwork really works. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening. Not at the HOA office, not in a neutral space, in her living room. That alone told me she was already nervous. I arrived early not to make a statement but to observe. Her house looked just like the others on the street. Same paint palette, same approved landscaping, same sense of control pressed into every corner. The door opened before I knocked. She smiled too quickly, thank you for coming. The living room smelled like fresh coffee and anxiety. 3 HOA board members sat on the couch, folders in their laps. No one met my eyes for more than a second. She gestured for me to sit. We're here to clear up what happened. I nodded, good. She launched into it immediately, talking fast, talking loud, rewriting the day in real time. She described herself as calm, professional, respectful. She described me as confrontational, defiant, emotional. I let her finish. Then I slid a folder onto the table. Inside were printed screenshots, time-stamped videos, statements from neighbors, the police incident number, still frames showing her reaching toward the flag stand. The room went quiet. One board member picked up a page, his hands shaking slightly. Is this from the funeral? Yes, I said, multiple angles. Her smile vanished. She tried to interrupt, but I kept going, not louder, just steadier. I explained the sequence, the warnings, the officer's instructions, the federal protections she'd ignored. I didn't accuse, I documented. This isn't an HOA dispute, I said. It's interference with a protected service. The word protected landed hard. She laughed nervously. That's dramatic. I met her eyes. It's statutory. The board members shifted. One cleared his throat, another stopped taking notes entirely. She stood up abruptly. This is intimidation. No, I replied, this is clarification. One of the board members finally spoke. Why weren't we informed of this beforehand? She froze. I handled it, she said quickly. He looked at the documents again. You handled it badly. That was the crack. Questions followed, why police were involved, why there were recordings, why residents were upset, why the city had already requested information. She tried to answer, but her words tangled. She contradicted herself twice, caught it too late both times. I stayed quiet. When the room finally settled, I stood. I don't want an apology, I said. I want assurances. Assurances of what? She snapped. That this never happens again, to anyone. Silence. One board member nodded slowly. We need to review this internally. She spun toward him. You're taking his side. I'm taking the association's side, he answered. That was when she realized she was alone. The meeting ended without handshakes, without smiles, without conclusions. As I left, she followed me to the door. You think you've won. I stopped. This was never about winning. Her voice dropped. Then what is it about? I turned back to her. Respect. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency session. No residents invited. No public comments allowed. By afternoon, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. Subject line: temporary suspension of HOA enforcement authority. And just like that, her power vanished. But the consequences were only beginning. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening. Not at the HOA office, not in a neutral space, in her living room. That alone told me she was already nervous. I arrived early not to make a statement but to observe. Her house looked just like the others on the street. Same paint palette, same approved landscaping, same sense of control pressed into every corner. The door opened before I knocked. She smiled too quickly. Thank you for coming. The living room smelled like fresh coffee and anxiety. 3 HOA board members sat on the couch, folders in their laps. No one met my eyes for more than a second. She gestured for me to sit. We're here to clear up what happened. I nodded. Good. She launched into it immediately, talking fast, talking loud, rewriting the day in real time. She described herself as calm, professional, respectful. She described me as confrontational, defiant, emotional. I let her finish. Then I slid a folder onto the table. Inside were printed screenshots, time-stamped videos, statements from neighbors, the police incident number, still frames showing her reaching toward the flag stand. The room went quiet. One board member picked up a page, his hands shaking slightly. Is this from the funeral? Yes, I said, multiple angles. Her smile vanished. She tried to interrupt, but I kept going, not louder, just steadier. I explained the sequence. The warnings, the officer's instructions, the federal protections she'd ignored. I didn't accuse, I documented. This isn't an HOA dispute, I said. It's interference with a protected service. The word protected landed hard. She laughed nervously. That's dramatic. I met her eyes. It's statutory. The board members shifted. One cleared his throat. Another stopped taking notes entirely. She stood up abruptly. This is intimidation. No, I replied. This is clarification. One of the board members finally spoke. Why weren't we informed of this beforehand? She froze. I handled it, she said quickly. He looked at the documents again. You handled it badly. That was the crack. Questions followed. Why police were involved, why there were recordings, why residents were upset, why the city had already requested information. She tried to answer, but her words tangled. She contradicted herself twice, caught it too late both times. I stayed quiet. When the room finally settled, I stood. I don't want an apology, I said. I want assurances. Assurances of what? She snapped. That this never happens again to anyone. Silence. One board member nodded slowly. We need to review this internally. She spun toward him. You're taking his side. I'm taking the association's side, he answered. That was when she realized she was alone. The meeting ended without handshakes, without smiles, without conclusions. As I left, she followed me to the door. You think you've won. I stopped. This was never about winning. Her voice dropped. Then what is it about? I turned back to her. Respect. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency session. No residents invited. No public comments allowed. By afternoon, an email went out to the entire neighborhood. Subject line: temporary suspension of HOA enforcement authority. And just like that, her power vanished. But the consequences were only beginning. The next few days were surreal. Neighbors stopped me on the street, some smiling nervously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Everyone had heard about the emergency meeting. Rumors flew faster than I could respond to texts, and every time I walked past her house, I could see her sitting in the living room, staring out the window like she was waiting for a war that would never come. The HOA board didn't waste any time. Within 48 hours, they called her in privately and informed her that she was being removed from her leadership position. They cited her repeated harassment, her interference with law enforcement, and the national attention she had drawn over the funeral. They even warned her that any further action could result in civil penalties. I watched from a distance as she tried to maintain composure, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She had been in control for so long that losing it, even partially, was unfamiliar and terrifying. By midweek, the neighborhood was quiet again, but this time it felt different. There was a tension of respect that hadn't existed before. People were walking taller, smiling at one another. The street that had been tense, judgmental, and overly managed now felt open, almost free. I received an email from the HOA board confirming that policies protecting memorial events and public gatherings were being drafted. No longer could someone show up and disrupt a funeral, parade, or other protected ceremony in the name of petty rules. It was official. The power structure had shifted, and for once the rules actually made sense. The day the family came back to collect the flag, I joined them. The honor guard stood silently, folding the colors one last time before presenting them to the widow. I watched as she accepted it, her hands shaking slightly, tears in her eyes. The weight of that flag carried the weight of loss, respect, and finally closure. Karen tried to drive by during the ceremony. I saw her in the distance, her SUV creeping along the street. She slowed, honking her horn once half-heartedly as if daring anyone to acknowledge her. No one did. She turned the corner and disappeared from view. I allowed myself a small smile. Justice doesn't always need loud confrontation. It's often quiet, final, and undeniable. Later that night, I sat on my porch reflecting on everything that had happened. The funeral, her interruptions, the complaints, the emails, the meetings. It had been exhausting. It had been stressful. But it had also reminded me of something important. Authority isn't about who shouts the loudest, who waves the biggest clipboard, or who threatens the most fines. Authority is earned through respect, integrity, and the ability to know when to step back. I knew Karen would likely tell herself she had been wronged. She might even try to fight it quietly behind the scenes. But the reality was clear. She had misjudged the situation, underestimated the people involved, and overestimated her control. And for a moment, just long enough for everyone to see, the consequences caught up with her. The neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The quiet dignity of respectful neighbors prevailed over arbitrary rules. And the memory of that day, the lesson learned, and the flag returned to its rightful place lingered. As for me, I went back to my life, quietly proud that I had protected what mattered most. Not just the flag, not just the ceremony, but the principle that even in a world full of rules and regulations, respect and honor always come first. And somewhere Karen probably still sat, frustrated and plotting, but I didn't need to worry about her anymore. She had already lost the one thing she truly craved, control over other people's lives, and that, I realized, was enough justice for one day. The day ended, the street was calm, the flags stood tall, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.